The percussion drill at the Gatams Basin in western Libya does not hum. It screams. It is a rhythmic, metallic shriek that vibrates through the soles of the workers' boots, echoing off the sun-bleached limestone escarpments that define this corner of the Sahara. Here, the air is a dry, suffocating weight, smelling of diesel exhaust and pulverized mineral dust. In the late summer of 2024, a hydrologic survey team was boring deep into the subterranean aquifers, seeking the fossil water trapped within the lower Cretaceous Nubian sandstone. They were looking for life-sustaining liquid, but at a depth of 214 meters, the drill bit encountered something that defied the predictable resistance of the sedimentary record. The lead engineer noticed the change first: a sudden, violent shudder in the drilling rig, followed by a high-pitched shearing sound that suggested the diamond-tipped bit had struck a material harder than the surrounding rock. They expected a vein of chert or perhaps a dense basaltic intrusion. When the core sample was finally extracted and hauled to the surface, the crew gathered around the steel cradle in a silence that contrasted sharply with the previous roar of the machinery. Contained within the cylindrical sheath of grayish-brown sandstone was a thin, anomalous horizontal layer, barely 3 centimeters thick. It was not stone. It was a slate-blue, metallic silicate with a surface so unnaturally smooth it appeared to have been polished to a submicron finish. Under the harsh Libyan sun, the material did not glint. It absorbed light, possessing a matte depth that seemed to pull at the eye. There were no crystalline structures typical of natural mineral formation. Instead, the edges where the material met the sandstone were fused, as if the surrounding sediment had been flash-heated into a glass-like state at the moment of contact. Laboratory analysis would later reveal the composition: an isotropic arrangement of silicon carbide and titanium diboride, a ceramic metallic composite that requires temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius to synthesize. In the geological record, this layer sat precisely within the Pleistocene strata, encased in sediment that had not seen the light of day for 1.2 million years. It was a fragment of something manufactured, a structural remnant or perhaps a discarded casing, deposited long before the first Homo sapiens ever walked the African savanna. This was the first crack in the official narrative of human progress, a physical intrusion of an impossible past into the present. The Earth is not a museum. It is a digestive system. We exist upon a crust that is constantly being consumed and reconstituted, a slow-motion conveyor belt that systematically erases the evidence of what came before. To understand why the history of advanced civilization feels so fragmented, one must first confront the sheer scale of geological erasure. The planet possesses 3 primary mechanisms for the destruction of evidence: subduction, chemical oxidation, and the relentless scouring of glacial cycles. Consider the oceanic crust. Because of the process of plate tectonics, the floor of the world's oceans is remarkably young, rarely exceeding 200 million years in age. At subduction zones, like those lining the Pacific Ring of Fire, entire continental shelves are forced downward into the mantle, where they are melted back into magma. Any coastal civilization that existed more than 250 million years ago has quite literally been swallowed by the planet, its monuments and machines recycled into the volcanic eruptions of the next era. On the surface, the chemistry of the atmosphere is equally hostile. Our modern world is built of steel, glass, and concrete. To a geologist looking back from 1 million years in the future, these materials are ephemeral. Steel oxidizes into rust, which then leaches into the soil as iron oxides, indistinguishable from natural mineral staining within centuries. Concrete, despite its apparent permanence, is chemically unstable over long durations. It crumbles under the cycle of freeze and thaw, eventually reverting to a lime-rich sediment. In 10,000 years, a mere heartbeat in geological time, every skyscraper, bridge, and dam currently standing will have collapsed into a layer of rubble no thicker than a few centimeters. In 50,000 years, that rubble will be covered by meters of silt, dust, and organic decay, compressed into a stratigraphic line that might be mistaken for a natural layer of gravel. Then there is the great unconformity. Throughout the stratigraphic record, there are massive gaps where hundreds of millions of years of rock are simply missing, scoured away by the advancing and retreating ice sheets of various glacial maximums. During the last glacial period, Ice sheets 3 kilometers thick ground the bedrock of North America and Europe into fine powder. Anything that stood on that land, cities, roads, or great libraries, was pulverized into glacial till, washed out to sea as silty runoff. When we search for the first civilizations, we are looking through a keyhole into a burning room. We see only the stones that were too large to be moved and too dense to be dissolved. We find the anomalies, the silicates in Libya, the precision-cut diorite in the Andes, because they are the rare survivors of a planetary-scale cleaning process. We are living on a graveyard where the headstones have been ground down to sand, and only the deepest foundations remain to haunt the geological record. To find the most haunting of these foundations, one must look toward the western coast of India, beneath the murky, silt-laden waters of the Gulf of Khambhat. In 2001, during a routine survey by the National Institute of Ocean Technology, side-scan sonar revealed a series of geometric anomalies stretching across a 9-kilometer stretch of the seabed 40 meters below the surface. The images did not show the jagged, chaotic silhouettes of natural reefs. Instead, they revealed rectilinear grids, massive foundation blocks, and what appeared to be the ruins of a sprawling urban complex, oriented along the paleochannel of a river that ceased to flow 10 millennia ago. The site, often referred to as the Khambhat Ruins, represents a logistical and archaeological paradox. Using acoustic imaging, researchers identified structures with dimensions exceeding 40 meters in length, constructed from massive, quarried blocks. These are not the modest mud brick dwellings of early Neolithic farmers. The scale suggests a municipal organization, a civilization capable of diverting water, leveling terrain, and transporting multi-ton stones. The paradox lies in the bathymetry and the timeline of the post-glacial sea level rise. At the end of the last ice age, during the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, the world's oceans rose by over 120 meters as the great northern ice sheets collapsed. The area now comprising the Gulf of Khambhat was dry land until approximately 9,500 years ago. According to the mainstream archaeological consensus, the humans of this era were just beginning the transition from hunter-gatherer bands to small, sedentary agricultural villages. The Neolithic Revolution was supposedly in its infancy, characterized by basic stone tools and the first tentative experiments with pottery. Yet, the Khambhat ruins suggest a fully realized urban center existing at the very moment agriculture was supposedly being invented elsewhere. DedgeNet recoveries from the site brought up a piece of carbonized wood that was later dated to 7,500 BCE. The wood bore the unmistakable marks of being worked by tools, grooves and notches that suggested it was part of a larger timber frame structure. If a city of this magnitude existed 9,000 years ago, it implies that the beginning of civilization as we teach it is actually the middle of a much older story. Mainstream skeptics have frequently challenged the Khambhat findings, arguing that the rectilinear structures seen on sonar are merely the result of natural jointing in the bedrock, shaped by the powerful tidal currents of the Gulf. They suggest that the artifacts recovered are pseudo-artifacts, naturally shaped stones that only appear to be tools to the biased eye. The carbon-dated wood, they argue, could have been washed into the area from an upstream forest, unrelated to the geological features on the seabed. This is the conservative view that nature is capable of mimicking geometry given enough time and water pressure. However, this explanation fails to account for the mathematical precision of the grid. Natural jointing in basalt or limestone typically follows hexagonal or irregular patterns dictated by the cooling of the rock or tectonic stress. It does not produce 9 kilometers of 90-degree intersections aligned to the cardinal directions. Furthermore, the sediment samples taken from within the ruins show a high concentration of microdebris, charcoal, hearth ash, and crushed ceramics that are not found in the surrounding seabed. The chemical signature is that of human habitation. Mathematically, the probability of tidal currents carving a perfectly straight, 3-tiered foundation that stretches for 40 meters is statistically negligible. We are looking at a drowned world, a victim of the meltwater pulses that punctuated the end of the last great winter. Moving from the sea to the sky, we find a different kind of anomaly in the Indonesian highlands. Gunung Padang, the Mountain of Light, was long thought to be a natural hill topped by a megalithic cemetery. For centuries, The local population visited the summit to prey among the thousands of columnar basalt blocks scattered across the terraces. But recent geophysical surveys, using ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and seismic tomography, have revealed that the hill is not a hill at all. It is a pyramid. The basalt columns that cover the surface of Gunung Padang are volcanic in origin, but they are not in their natural state. In nature, columnar basalt forms vertical pencils as lava cools and contracts. At Gunung Padang, these columns have been harvested, trimmed, and laid horizontally like bricks to form massive retaining walls and chambers. The structure is a stepped pyramid of immense proportions, buried under layers of soil and vegetation that have accumulated over millennia. The core drilling at Gunung Padang tells a story that mainstream history is not yet ready to accept. While the surface structures date to approximately 500 BCE, the layers beneath them are far older. Organic matter trapped within the mortar of Layer 2, a secondary construction phase deep within the mound, has been carbon dated to 7000 BCE. Deeper still, Layer 3, which contains large man-made cavities and chambers, has return dates as old as 22,000 BCE. This places the construction of the primary core of Gunung Padang in the depths of the last glacial maximum. At this time, according to the standard model, the Indonesian archipelago was part of a vast continent known as Sundaland. The inhabitants of Sundaland are characterized in textbooks as nomadic foragers, using simple stone flakes to hunt and gather in the tropical rainforests. The idea that they possessed the social hierarchy, engineering knowledge, and sheer manpower to construct a pyramid larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza is a direct contradiction of the established timeline of human development. Skeptics argue that the chambers detected by radar are merely natural lava tubes or air pockets within the volcanic neck of the hill. They suggest that the mortar found in the core samples is actually a natural silica-rich weathering product, not a man-made cement. To the mainstream geologist, Gunung Padang is a natural formation with a bit of ancient landscaping on top. They point to the lack of high-technology artifacts, no gears, no metal alloys, no written records, as proof that no advanced civilization could have been involved. Yet, the rebuttal lies in the engineering of the basalt itself. The basalt columns at Gunung Padang show clear evidence of dressing, the removal of material to ensure a flush fit between blocks. More importantly, the electrical resistivity surveys show that the lava tubes are perfectly rectangular and interconnected by a series of shafts. Nature does not abhor a vacuum, but it rarely constructs a vacuum with 90-degree corners and a symmetrical layout. The volume of material moved at Gunung Padang exceeds several 100,000 cubic meters. This is not the work of a band of foragers. It is the work of a state. And if that state existed 22,000 years ago, then our understanding of the Pleistocene is fundamentally flawed. The silence of the past is not an absence of sound. It is a frequency we have forgotten how to hear. As we move deeper into the investigation, the evidence shifts from the submerged and the buried to the mathematical and the cartographic. We begin to see a pattern not of slow, linear progress, but of a high-altitude, global civilization that was forced to watch its world disappear. To find the next piece of this global jigsaw, one must navigate the vast, blue isolation of the Federated States of Micronesia. Here, on the eastern edge of the island of Pohnpei, lies Nan Madol, a ruined city of 92 artificial islets constructed entirely of massive, prismatic basalt columns. The air here is heavy with the scent of brackish water and decaying mangrove roots, a thick, humid veil that clings to the skin. The silence is broken only by the rhythmic slap of the tide against the dark stone and the occasional cry of a fruit bat overhead. Nan Madol is not merely an archaeological site. It is a weight, 250 million tons of volcanic rock stacked into the lagoon with a precision that defies the primitive technologies attributed to its supposed builders. The scale of Nan Madol is staggering. The city covers approximately 18 square kilometers, with stone walls that rise 15 meters high and reach thicknesses of 5 meters. These walls are composed of naturally occurring basalt logs, hexagonal and pentagonal columns formed by the cooling of volcanic plugs. However, these columns were not quarried on the island of Pohnpei in any way that matches the mineralogical signature of the city itself. Geochemical analysis of the stones reveals that the basalt used in the most massive foundations originates from a volcanic vent on the opposite side of the island, separated by a rugged, jungle-choked mountain range and miles of treacherous coral reefs. The paradox of Nan Madol lies in the sheer physics of its assembly. Each basalt column weighs between 5 and 50 tons. To build the city, an estimated 250 million tons of stone had to be transported across the island or around its coastline. According to the mainstream archaeological narrative, Nan Madol was constructed by the Sotalar dynasty between 1200 and 1500 CE. This timeline suggests a population of perhaps 25,000 people, working with outrigger canoes, fiber ropes, and wooden rollers. The skeptic's view, the one found in the standard textbooks, is that the Sotalar utilized a vast, coerced labor force that spent centuries moving the stones, one by one, using primitive yet effective methods of leverage and buoyancy. They suggest that the stones were floated on large rafts during the high tide, then levered into place as the water receded. It is a story of human persistence over insurmountable odds, a narrative that fits neatly into the linear progression of cultural development. However, this explanation collapses when subjected to the cold mathematics of marine engineering. A basalt column weighing 50 tons has a volume of approximately 18 cubic meters. To float such a mass, a raft would require a displacement capacity far exceeding anything an outrigger canoe or a lash timber platform could provide in the choppy, shallow waters of a coral lagoon. Furthermore, recent underwater surveys using side-scan sonar have revealed that the foundations of Nan Madol do not sit upon the coral reef. They extend downward, through the coral, resting on the submerged volcanic bedrock nearly 20 meters below the current sea level. This bathymetric data suggests a horrifyingly different timeline. For the foundations of Nan Madol to have been laid on dry bedrock, the city must have been commissioned when the sea level was at least 20 meters lower than it is today. This would place the primary construction phase not in the 14th century, but at the end of the last ice age, roughly 11,000 years ago, during the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. This was a period when the Pacific Plate was adjusting to the massive redistribution of weight as the continental ice sheets melted. The ruins we see today are merely the upper battlements of a much older, much larger megalithic complex that has been slowly drowning for 10 millennia. The stones of Nan Madol carry another anomaly, a remnant magnetic signature. When basalt cools, the magnetite crystals within the rock align themselves with the Earth's magnetic field. If a stone is moved and reoriented, its internal compass will point in a direction inconsistent with the current North Pole. Measurements taken at the main temple of Nanduas show that the basalt columns possess a magnetic orientation that is wildly inconsistent with their current placement, suggesting that the stones were subjected to intense magnetic flux or were harvested and placed during a geomagnetic excursion, a period when the Earth's poles were in the process of flipping. Such excursions are documented in the stratigraphic record, but the most recent one occurred 41,000 years ago, during the Lost Champs event. From the humid depths of the Pacific, we ascend to the oxygen-thin air of the Bolivian Altiplano, 12,000 feet above sea level. Here, amidst the stark, wind-swept ruins of Tiwanaku, lies the site of Puma Punku. The landscape is a study in desolation, a high-altitude desert where the sun is a punishing glare and the wind carries the fine, abrasive dust of pulverized red sandstone. The ground is hard, cracked, and seemingly devoid of life, yet it is littered with the most sophisticated stonework found anywhere on the planet. Puma Punku is characterized by its H-blocks, massive, interlocking units of gray andesite and red sandstone. Unlike the rounded, organic shapes of many ancient ruins, the blocks at Puma Punku are defined by razor-sharp 90-degree angles, perfectly flat planes, and intricate internal grooves that resemble modern modular construction. The largest of these blocks, the Plataforma Litica, is a single slab of red sandstone weighing an estimated 131 tons. The paradox of Puma Punku is found in the material itself. Andesite and diorite are among the hardest stones on the Mohs scale, surpassed only by precious gems and high-carbon steel. Yet, the surfaces of these blocks are finished to a tolerance of within a few thousandths of an inch. There are drill holes narrow, deep, and perfectly circular that penetrate the stone at precise intervals. There are recessed niches where the interior corners are so sharp they would be difficult to achieve today without the use of CNC milling machines or diamond-tip saws. The mainstream archaeological consensus attributes Puma Punku to the Tiwanaku culture, dating the site to approximately 500 or 600 CE. The official explanation for the precision of the stonework involves the use of copper tools, stone hammers, and sand as an abrasive. They argue that with enough time and a large enough labor force, even the hardest stone can be worn down into the shapes we see today. They point to the lack of high-technology debris as evidence that the builders were limited to the tools of the Bronze Age. But the rebuttal is written into the microscopic texture of the stone. When the internal grooves of the H-blocks are examined under scanning electron microscopy, SEM, the surface does not show the bruising or irregular striations associated with manual abrasion. Instead, the surface is characterized by clean, unidirectional microgrooves that suggest a high-speed removal of material. Mathematically, the energy required to cut a 90-degree interior corner into diorite using copper and sand is prohibitive. The copper would wear away hundreds of times faster than the stone, and the slurry of sand would inevitably round the edges of the cut. The crispness of the corners at Puma Punku is a physical impossibility for the tools available to a 6th century Andean culture. Geologically, the site is equally anomalous. Puma Punku sits on a layer of heavy, clay-rich sediment that was deposited by a massive alluvial event, a sudden, violent flood that swept across the Altiplano. This sediment layer contains fragmented human remains, smashed pottery, and tools, all mixed together in a chaotic death layer. Below this flood deposit, the foundations of the megalithic structures are found. Carbon dating of organic material trapped beneath the blocks has return dates as old as 15,000 BCE. This suggests that Puma Punku was not a city built in the 6th century, but a pre-existing complex that was devastated by a cataclysmic inundation at the end of the Pleistocene. The Tiwanaku people did not build Puma Punku. They found it. They moved into the ruins, cleared away the sediment where they could, and built their own, much cruder mud brick and fieldstone structures on top of the ancient, precision-engineered foundations. We have mistaken the scavengers for the architects. As we move across the planet, from the drowned islands of the Pacific to the frozen heights of the Andes, the evidence of a global erasure mantle becomes undeniable. We are finding the same motifs: the use of multi-ton megaliths, the preference for hard volcanic stones, the orientation to cardinal directions, and the placement of sites in locations that were geologically stable during the wild climate swings of the Great Ice Age. The story of the first civilizations is increasingly looking like a story of survival. The maps we use today are a lie. They show a world of stable coastlines and predictable weather. But if we look at the bathymetry of the continental shelves, we see the ghosts of a lost world. When the sea levels were 120 meters lower, the Earth's landmass was increased by nearly 10 million square miles, an area the size of North America. This lost coast was where the majority of human populations would have settled, as the high-latitude regions were locked under miles of ice. Every major river delta on Earth, the Nile, the Indus, the Mississippi, the Yangtze, was once hundreds of miles longer. The coastal plains that are now beneath the waves were the breadbaskets of the Pleistocene. When the ice melted, it didn't happen gradually. The geological record shows 3 distinct periods of rapid sea level rise, known as meltwater pulses. During these events, the oceans could rise by several meters in a single decade. For a civilization built on the coast, this was not a flood in the biblical sense. It was the permanent loss of their world. The survivors would have been pushed inland, forced to higher ground. They would have arrived in places like the Altiplano or the Ethiopian highlands as refugees, carrying with them the remnants of a shattered technology. They built in stone because stone was the only material that could survive the coming centuries of chaos. They built with precision because precision was a requirement of their engineering, a lingering habit from a world of machines and mathematics. But as the centuries turned into millennia, the knowledge began to fade. The specialized tools were lost or broke and could not be repaired. The refined alloys oxidized into dust. The complex social structures required to maintain an advanced civilization collapsed under the pressure of survival. What remained were the Mountain of Light in Indonesia, the City of the Sea in India, and the H-blocks of Bolivia, the silent, heavy bones of a predecessor species that we have only just begun to recognize as our own. The atmosphere of this investigation is one of profound melancholy. It is the realization that we are not the first to reach the summit of human achievement. We are merely the latest. We look at the ruins of Nan Madol and see a mystery, but the true mystery is our own blindness. We have been taught to see history as a ladder, but the geological record suggests it is a cycle, a series of rises and falls, punctuated by the cold, indifferent hand of the planet. The weight of the sediment is not just a physical reality. It is a psychological one. We are buried under the weight of our own assumptions. We believe that because we have smartphones and satellites, we are the pinnacle of the human story. But the silicates in Libya and the precision cuts in the Andes suggest that there were others who knew the stars as well as we do, who manipulated the crust of the Earth with a confidence we can only imagine, and who were eventually erased by the very planet they sought to master. The investigation now turns to the final, most confronting piece of the puzzle, the unifying theory of the Great Reset. We must look at the data not as isolated anomalies, but as a single, coherent signal. The signal tells us that approximately 12,800 years ago, the Earth underwent a sudden and violent shift known as the Younger Dryas. Temperatures plummeted, the ice sheets surged, and then, just as suddenly, they melted. This was the moment of the erasure. This was the moment the First World died. In the stratigraphic layers of the Younger Dryas boundary, researchers have found a thin layer of nanodiamonds and magnetic spherules, the telltale signs of a high-energy impact event. This was the hammer of the gods, a cometary bombardment that struck the North American ice sheet, flash melting the glaciers and sending a wall of water into the oceans. The resulting megafloods scoured the continents, buried the cities, and reset the clock for humanity. The silence of the Pleistocene is not the silence of a void. It is the silence of a grave. And as we dig through the ruins of Puma Punku or scan the depths of the Gulf of Khambhat, we are not just uncovering the past. We are looking into a mirror. We are seeing what happens to a civilization when the Earth decides to turn the page. The textures of the stone, the hardness of the andesite, and the depth of the submerged foundations are the only testimony left. They are the forgotten Earth, speaking to us across the abyss of deep time. The next step is to understand the mechanics of the transition. How did the survivors transition from a high-technology global culture to the primitive agriculturalists we find at the dawn of the Holocene? To answer that, we must look at the seeds, not just the seeds of plants, but the seeds of myth and the anomalous genetics of the crops we still eat today. The story is not over. It is simply entering its most challenging chapter. To find the most elusive traces of this predecessor civilization, one must look beyond the stones and the seabed into the very code of life itself. In the high valleys of the Balsas River Basin in Mexico, the history of the world is hidden inside a grain of starch. The plant is Z-maize, known to the modern world as maize or corn. Unlike any other cereal grain utilized by humanity, wheat, rice, or barley, maize has no wild counterpart. There is no such thing as wild corn. If left to its own devices in a forest or a field, maize will become extinct within a few generations because it cannot disperse its own seeds. It is a plant that requires the intervention of a technician to survive. The official botanical narrative suggests that maize was domesticated from a wild grass called teosinte approximately 9,000 years ago. Teosinte is a spindly, multi-branched weed with tiny ears, no longer than a human thumbnail, containing 5 to 7 rock-hard kernels that shatter upon ripening. To transform teosinte into the modern maize plant, a single-stalk giant with hundreds of soft, sugar-rich kernels wrapped in a protective husk, requires a massive, coordinated restructuring of the plant's entire genetic architecture. In the laboratories of the late 20th century, geneticists identified that this transition involved specific, targeted mutations in 5 key gene complexes. In a natural, Darwinian environment, these mutations are deleterious. They would lead to the immediate death of the plant in the wild. Yet, in the archaeological record of the Tehuacan Valley, maize appears almost fully formed, a biological explosion that lacks the thousands of years of intermediate, transitional forms one would expect from slow, selective breeding. The paradox is mathematical. The statistical probability of 5 independent, major genetic mutations occurring simultaneously and being successfully curated by nomadic hunter-gatherers, who would have had to prevent the improved plants from crossbreeding with the surrounding oceans of wild teosinte for centuries, is vanishingly small. We are looking at a process that resembles modern CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing more than it does the trial and error of Neolithic foragers. When we examine the microscopic structure of the ancient maize kernels found in the Gwilanakwit's cave, we see something even more disturbing. Under the scanning electron microscope, the cellular walls of these 9,000-year-old grains show a specific crystalline arrangement of lignin that is optimized for long-term storage and resistance to fungal rot. It is as if the plant was designed not just to be eaten, but to be a biological backup, a high-calorie, long shelf-life fuel source engineered to sustain a population through a period of extreme climatic instability. If we accept the possibility that maize is an engineered artifact, a soft technology left behind by a civilization that understood the language of the genome, then we must ask where they went when the sky turned to fire. The answer lies deep beneath the dusty, wind-scoured plains of the Anatolian Plateau in modern-day Turkey. The air inside the tunnels of Derinkuyu is still cold and smells faintly of damp basalt and ancient, pulverized bone. It is a dry, suffocating stillness that weighs on the chest. Here, in the region of Cappadocia, the earth is composed of tuff, a soft, volcanic ash that has compressed over millions of years into a workable, yet structurally sound, subterranean canvas. And someone, long before the records of the Hittites or the Phrygians, carved a city into the very marrow of the world. Derinkuyu is not a cave system. It is a vertical metropolis. It descends 18 levels into the crust, reaching a depth of over 85 meters. It is equipped with a sophisticated ventilation system, a central shaft that provides fresh air to the lowest levels, even when the surface is completely sealed. There are dining halls, stables, wine presses, and chapels, all interconnected by a labyrinth of narrow, sloping passages. Most notably, each level can be independently sealed by massive, circular stone doors, ton-weight discs of hard silicate that can only be moved from the inside. The mainstream archaeological view is that Derinkuyu was a refuge, built by early Christians or perhaps the Phrygians in the 8th century BCE to hide from invading armies. The skeptics point to the presence of Byzantine crosses and later pottery as proof of its origins. They argue that the tuff is so easy to carve that a few hundred determined villagers could have hollowed out the entire complex in a matter of decades. But the engineering of the ventilation shafts tells a different story. The shafts are not merely holes in the ceiling. They are precisely angled to utilize the stack effect, drawing warm air out and cool air in through a series of thermal siphons. This requires an advanced understanding of fluid dynamics and atmospheric pressure. Furthermore, the capacity of Derinkuyu is estimated at 20,000 people. To support such a population underground for any length of time requires more than just air. It requires a closed-loop system for waste management and water purification, both of which are present in the city's design, integrated into the lowest, most inaccessible levels. Mathematically, the refuge theory fails when one considers the oxygen requirements. If 20,000 people were hiding from an invading army, the carbon dioxide levels would become lethal within hours unless the ventilation was perfectly maintained. More importantly, why build 18 levels deep to hide from a terrestrial army? A simple stone wall or a mountain fortress would suffice. Derinkuyu was not designed to hide from men. It was designed to survive an atmospheric catastrophe. The city is a fallout shelter. The thickness of the rock overhead provides near-total protection from the thermal radiation of an impact event or the plummeting temperatures of a sudden volcanic winter. The circular stone doors are not designed to stop a phalanx of soldiers. They are airlocks designed to seal the population away from a toxic or frozen exterior. When we look at the geological context of the Anatolian tuff, we find that the most significant scouring of the tunnel entrances occurred during the same Younger Dryas period that saw the drowning of Nan Madol and the burial of Puma Punku. We are beginning to see the outlines of a great reset. A global civilization, possessing both the hard engineering of the Andes and the soft, genetic engineering of the Mexican highlands, found itself facing an extinction-level event. They were a maritime culture, centered on the coastlines that are now 40 fathoms deep. When the first signs of the catastrophe appeared, perhaps a series of high-altitude cometary fragments or a sudden shift in the Earth's magnetic field, they initiated a survival protocol. They moved inland to the high plateaus. They moved downward into the tuff of Turkey and the granite of the Himalayas. They brought with them their most precious technologies: the seeds of Z-maze, the maps of the stars, and the mathematical constants that define the physical world. This brings us to the climax of the investigation, the unifying theory of the Erasure Mantle. If we look at the world map not as a static image, but as a dynamic, shifting puzzle, the anomalies begin to align into a single, devastating timeline. Approximately 12,800 years ago, the Earth was emerging from the last great ice age. The climate was warming, and the massive ice sheets covering North America and Northern Europe were beginning to retreat. This was the world of the first civilization, a period we might call the late Pleistocene zenith. They were a culture that utilized the entire planet, from the mineral-rich mountains of the Andes to the fertile, low-lying plains of the Sunda Shelf. Then the sky fell. The younger Dryas impact hypothesis, once dismissed as pseudoscience, has gained significant mainstream traction in the last decade. The evidence is found in the black mat layer, a thin, carbon-rich stratigraphic line found across 4 continents, dating precisely to 10,800 BCE. This layer contains high concentrations of platinum, iridium, and nanodiamonds, microscopic carbon structures that can only be formed under the extreme heat and pressure of a cosmic impact. The data suggests that a large comet, perhaps over 100 kilometers in diameter, entered the inner solar system and fragmented. Multiple pieces, some over a mile wide, struck the North American ice sheet. The result was a thermal pulse that flash-melted millions of cubic miles of ice in seconds. This was the Great Flood. It wasn't a slow rise of the tides. It was a series of catastrophic meltwater pulses that sent walls of water, hundreds of feet high, roaring across the continents. The impact also triggered a crustal displacement. The sudden redistribution of weight, as the massive northern ice sheets disappeared and the ocean basins filled, put immense stress on the Earth's lithosphere. The crust shifted. The North Pole, which may have been located in the Hudson Bay area, moved to its current position. This shift would have caused the planet to literally shudder, triggering volcanic eruptions on a global scale and plunging the atmosphere into a volcanic winter that lasted for over 1,000 years. This was the Younger Dryas, a 1,200-year period of absolute chaos. In this environment, the first civilization did not just fall. It was pulverized. Their coastal cities were obliterated by the initial tsunamis. Their infrastructure was buried under hundreds of feet of glacial silt and volcanic ash. The survivors were scattered, reduced to a desperate, subsistence existence in a world that had become unrecognizable. The megalithic sites we find today, Gunung Padang, Puma Punku, Nan Madol, are the high water marks of this collapse. They were the mountain outposts, the survival bunkers, and the ritual centers built by a dying culture that was trying to preserve its identity. They used the hardest stones and the largest blocks because they knew the Earth was in a state of violent flux. They were building for deep time, hoping that some fragment of their knowledge would survive the Erasure Mantle. But as the centuries of the Younger Dryas wore on, the deep knowledge became high myth. The engineering was forgotten, but the stories remained. The memory of the Sun Kings, who could move stones with sound, became the legends of the gods. The engineered backup seeds, like maize, became gifts from the heavens. The survivors of the high plateaus eventually descended back into the valleys as the climate stabilized 10,000 years ago, but they were no longer the masters of the world. They were refugees starting again from zero, using the broken remnants of a technology they could no longer replicate. The so what of this investigation is not merely an academic exercise in archaeology. It is a fundamental shift in our understanding of human destiny. We have been taught that we are a linear species, moving from the cave to the skyscraper in a steady, unbroken climb. But the geological record suggests we are a cyclic species. We are a civilization with amnesia, living on the ruins of a predecessor that was just as ambitious, just as sophisticated, and just as vulnerable as we are. The modern relevance is chilling. We currently live in a period of relative climatic stability that has lasted for 10,000 years, the Holocene. This is the longest Great Summer in the last million years of Earth's history. We have built our entire world, our cities, our data centers, our global food supply, on the assumption that the coastlines will stay where they are and the rains will come when they are supposed to. But the black mat layer in the soil and the silicate composite in the Libyan desert are silent warnings. They tell us that the Earth is not a stable platform. It is a dynamic, often violent system that periodically resets itself. We look at the ruins of Puma Punku and wonder how they moved the stones, but we should be wondering why they felt the need to build them so large. They were building against the end of the world. The textures of the forgotten Earth are the braille of our own future. When we touch the cold, precision-cut andesite of the Bolivian highlands or walk through the lightless tunnels of Derinkuyu, we are touching the limit of human endurance. We are seeing what remains when everything else is stripped away. The will to survive, the drive to build, and the hope that something, even just a line of code in a grain of corn, will make it through to the next era. The investigation concludes not with a final answer, but with a new set of eyes. To look at a mountain and see a buried pyramid. To look at a seabed and see a drowned capital. To look at a weed and see a genetic masterpiece. The history of the world is not what we were told. It is much older, much darker, and far more spectacular. We are not the first, and if the cycles of the Great Reset continue, we will not be the last. The silence of the strata is finally beginning to speak, and it is telling us that the Earth remembers even when we do not. The silence of the stone is not merely a physical presence. It is a mathematical resonance. To move from the drowned coastlines and the subterranean shelters into the heart of the great megalithic complexes is to move from the realm of survival into the realm of transmission. If the first civilization knew their world was ending, if they watched the stars shift and the ice melt with the cold certainty of a species that understood the mechanics of the solar system, then their final act would not have been merely to hide. It would have been to leave a message that could survive the Erasure Mantle. They would have built time capsules made of the only material capable of enduring for tens of thousands of years. High-density silicate rock, arranged according to the universal language of geometry and geodesy. To find the first of these capsules, one must stand on the Giza Plateau at dusk, when the desert wind carries the scent of parched limestone and the distant, metallic tang of the Nile. The Great Pyramid of Giza is often described as a tomb, a monument to the ego of a 4th dynasty pharaoh named Khufu. But the tomb theory is a modern imposition, a narrative designed to fit the pyramid into the linear progression of human history. When we strip away the cultural labels and look at the structure through the lens of engineering and planetary science, a different, more chilling purpose emerges. The Great Pyramid is a scale model of the northern hemisphere of the Earth. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is a mathematical fact. If you take the height of the pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you arrive at the polar radius of the Earth with a precision of 99.7%. If you take the perimeter of the pyramid's base and multiply it by the same factor, 43,200, you arrive at the equatorial circumference of the Earth. The number 43,200 is not arbitrary. It is a key precessional number. The Earth wobbles on its axis like a slowing top, a cycle known as the precession of the equinoxes, which takes 25,920 years to complete. In this cycle, the Sun moves through 1 degree of the zodiac every 72 years. 43,200 is exactly 600 times 72. The builders of the Giza complex were not just stacking stones. They were embedding the dimensions of the planet into the very geometry of the monument. They were demonstrating that they knew the Earth was a sphere, they knew its exact dimensions, and they knew the rate at which it wobbled through space. This knowledge, according to the mainstream timeline, should not have existed until the age of the Enlightenment, thousands of years after the pyramids were supposedly built. The physical reality of the pyramid is equally defiant. The structure is composed of approximately 2.3 million blocks of stone, ranging from 2 to 80 tons each. These are not merely stones. They are precision-cut modules, the mortar joints between the massive limestone casing stones, most of which were stripped away in the Middle Ages, are less than 0.02 inches wide. This is a gap thinner than a human fingernail, yet it is filled with a cement that is harder than the rock itself. To achieve this level of precision across a base that covers 13 acres requires a level of surveying technology that exceeds the copper chisels and hemp ropes of the Bronze Age. The skeptic's view is that the Egyptians were simply master craftsmen who utilized a massive, generational labor force to achieve these results through sheer persistence. They suggest that the geodetic alignments are numerological coincidences, the result of cherry-picking numbers from a complex structure until a pattern emerges. They argue that the pyramid's orientation to true north, within 3/60ths of a degree, was achieved by observing the stars with simple transit tools. But the rebuttal lies in the king's chamber. High within the bowels of the pyramid, protected by thousands of tons of masonry, sits a room made entirely of red Aswan granite. This stone was hauled from a quarry 500 miles to the south. Each block in the ceiling of this chamber weighs 70 tons. There are no inscriptions, no carvings, no signs of a funeral. In the center sits the coffer, a tub carved from a single block of dark granite. The internal corners of the coffer show the marks of a fixed-point drill that was oscillating at a high frequency, cutting through the quartz crystals of the granite with a feed rate that modern diamond drills would struggle to match. The king's chamber is not a bedroom for a dead king. It is a resonator. The granite is rich in quartz, a piezoelectric mineral that generates an electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress. The entire pyramid acts as a massive acoustic lens, focusing the low-frequency vibrations of the Earth, the hum of the planet, into the king's chamber. When researchers have placed sensitive microphones inside the coffer, they have found that the chamber is tuned to a specific frequency, 440 Hz or a above middle C. This is a machine, a device designed to interact with the physical properties of the Earth itself. Moving 4,000 miles to the east, we find the second half of this celestial mirror in the jungles of Cambodia. Angkor Wat is the largest religious monument in the world, a sprawling complex of sandstone and laterite that rises above the tropical canopy like a stone forest. The air here is thick with the sound of cicadas and the heavy, sweet scent of rotting vegetation. The stones are covered in a fine patina of gray lichen and green moss, a testament to the relentless humidity of the Mekong Basin. Angkor Wat was built in the 12th century CE by the Khmer king Suryavarman II, or so the inscriptions tell us. But like Giza, the layout of Angkor suggests an older, more profound architecture. The complex is a terrestrial map of the constellation Draco, as it appeared on the spring equinox in 10,500 BCE. This date, 10.5 millennia before the Khmer Empire, is the same date that the three pyramids of Giza align perfectly with the Belt of Orion. This precessional code is repeated across the Angkor complex. There are 72 major stone temples in the region, a number that, again, represents the 72 years it takes for the Earth to move 1 degree through its precessional cycle. The causeway leading to the main temple is flanked by 108 giant stone figures, 54 Devas and 54 Asuras, engaged in the churning of the Milky Ocean. 108 is another precessional number, 72 plus 36. The entire site is a clock, frozen in stone, designed to mark the great year of 25,920 years. The paradox of Angkor lies in its hydraulic engineering. The city was built on a vast, artificial island surrounded by a moat that is nearly 4 miles long. This moat was not for defense, it was a structural stabilizer. The sandy soil of the region is unstable. It shifts with the seasonal monsoon rains. By building a massive, rectangular moat, the architects created a pressure valve that kept the groundwater levels constant beneath the temple, preventing the millions of tons of stone from sinking into the mud. This is advanced civil engineering, integrated into a celestial map that references a date at the very end of the last ice age. The mainstream explanation for Angkor is that the Khmer were obsessed with cosmology and utilized Hindu mythology to organize their architecture. They argue that the 10,500 BCE alignment is a statistical ghost, a coincidental arrangement of buildings that only appears significant if you search for it. But the rebuttal is found in the Great Circle alignment. If you take a globe and draw a line connecting the Giza Plateau to the ruins of Petra in Jordan, it continues to the ancient city of Persepolis in Iran, then to Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, then to the temples of Khajuraho in India, then to Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and finally to the isolated outpost of Easter Island in the Pacific. This line is a great circle that encompasses the circumference of the Earth. These sites, built by different cultures at supposedly different times in vastly different environments, all sit on a single mathematically precise line that is tilted at 30 degrees to the equator. The probability of the most significant megalithic sites on Earth falling onto a single great circle by accident is billions to one. It implies a global plan, a planetary grid, that was established long before the rise of the known civilizations. It suggests that the first civilization was not just maritime, but global, and that they possessed a level of spherical trigonometry and cartography that allowed them to survey the entire planet from a high-altitude or orbital perspective. As we walk through the long, echoing galleries of Angkor or stand in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, the atmosphere is one of profound, intellectual intimidation. We are being spoken to in a language of numbers and stars. We are seeing the remnants of a global geodetic survey that was completed before the Great Reset. The so what of this mathematical architecture is that it provides a bridge across the Erasure Mantle. While the steel of our world will rust and our digital records will degrade into bit rot within centuries, these stone monuments were designed to last for 30,000 years. They were built to ensure that if a future civilization ever reached a certain level of mathematical and astronomical competence, they would look at these structures and recognize a mirror of their own knowledge. They would realize that they were not the first to measure the Earth. This leads us to the most unsettling part of the mystery, the missing middle. If these sites are the survivors of a global culture that existed 12,000 years ago, what happened to the rest of their technology? Where are the factories? Where are the ships? Where are the metal tools that were required to cut the granite and drill the diorite? The answer lies in the recycling of history. Every civilization is a scavenger. The Romans built with Greek stones. The medieval Europeans built with Roman stones. The modern world builds on the ruins of everything that came before. In the chaos following the younger Dryas impact, the survivors would have salvaged every scrap of metal, every refined alloy, and every piece of functioning machinery. Over 10,000 years, those items would have been melted down, repurposed, and eventually lost to oxidation. Only the too large to move remained. We find anomalous artifacts only when they are encased in a protective geological matrix, like the silicate layer in Libya or the iron hammer found in Cretaceous rock. The rest has been ground down by the slow mill of time. The forgotten Earth is not just a collection of ruins. It is a signal. It is the persistent, low-frequency hum of a predecessor that refuses to stay buried. We are now at a point where our own technology, our satellites, our LiDAR, and our genetic sequencing is finally allowing us to decode the message. We are realizing that the myths of the Golden Age and the gods who came from the sky were not fantasies. They were the distorted memories of a global, high-technology culture that was decimated by the planet it thought it had mastered. The climax of this story is not a discovery, but a realization. We are living in the second half of a much longer human story. The first half ended in fire and flood, 12,800 years ago. The monuments of Giza and Angkor are the closing credits of that first act, left behind to remind us that the stage can be cleared at any moment. The investigation now moves to the final evidence, the clues found in the most inhospitable place on Earth, Antarctica. As the ice melts in the southern continent, it is revealing landforms and anomalies that match the impossible maps of the 16th century. Maps that show Antarctica without ice, mapped with a precision that requires the same global survey that aligned the Great Circle. The story is expanding, moving from the desert and the jungle to the ice. The forgotten Earth is revealing its final secrets, and they are more spectacular than we ever dared to imagine. The silence of the southern pole is a physical entity. It is a sterile, acoustic void where the only sound is the internal rhythm of one's own pulse and the occasional, thunderous crack of the ice sheet adjusting to the immense pressure of its own mass. Antarctica is a continent of erasure, a 2-mile-thick mantle of frozen water that hides an entire landmass larger than Europe. For centuries, the mainstream geological consensus has held that this ice sheet has been stable for at least 15 million years, a permanent white desert that predates the very evolution of the human genus. But in the dust-filled archives of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a fragment of gazelle-skin parchment suggests a different reality. The Piri Reis map, compiled in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer of the same name, is a document that should not exist. It is a portolan chart, a navigator's map showing the western coasts of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and, most impossibly, the northern coast of Antarctica. The paradox of the Piri Reis map is not merely that it depicts a continent that would not be officially discovered for another 300 years. The true anomaly lies in the detail of the coastline. The map shows the Queen Maud Land region of Antarctica without its ice cover. It depicts mountain ranges, coastal plateaus, and river valleys with a topographical accuracy that remained unverified until the mid-20th century. In 1949, the Swedish-British-Norwegian Antarctic expedition conducted a comprehensive seismic survey of the Queen Maud Land coast. Using echo-sounding equipment, they mapped the subglacial topography, the actual shape of the land beneath the ice. The results were a perfect match for the Piri Reis map. The coastline shown on the 16th century parchment was not the edge of the ice shelf. It was the edge of the continent itself, as it would appear if the ice were removed. The skeptic's view, frequently cited in cartographic journals, is that the Piri Reis map is simply a distorted representation of the South American coastline, curved around the bottom of the parchment to fit the space. They argue that the mountains are merely stylized illustrations common to the era and that any resemblance to subglacial Antarctica is a pareidolia of geography, a case of modern researchers seeing what they want to see in the vague outlines of a medieval chart. However, the rebuttal is found in the mathematics of the projection. Piri Reis himself wrote in his marginal notes that he did not survey these lands himself. He compiled his map from 20 older source maps, some of which he claimed dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. When the Piri Reis map is analyzed using modern spherical trigonometry, it becomes clear that the original source maps utilized a sophisticated, equidistant azimuthal projection. This is a method of mapping a spherical Earth onto a flat surface that requires a central home point. When researchers calculated the center of the Piri Reis projection, they found it was not in Istanbul nor in Europe. The center of the map, the point from which all the distances and angles are calculated, is the Giza Plateau in Egypt. This implies that the original source maps were created by a civilization that viewed the world from the perspective of the Great Pyramid, and who possessed a level of cartographic science that could accurately map the entire Atlantic basin, including the subglacial contours of the southern pole. The geological implications are devastating to the standard model. For the Queen Maud Land coast to have been mapped without ice, it must have been ice-free. According to the analysis of sediment cores taken from the Ross Sea, the last time the Antarctic coast was free of ice and supported flowing rivers was approximately 4,000 to 6,000 BCE. This places the source map makers in the same window as the builders of the Khambhat ruins and the primary core of Gunung Padang. It suggests a global maritime culture that was active during the post-glacial climatic optimum, a period when the world was significantly warmer and the southern continent was still accessible. But how could a continent move from a temperate climate to a frozen wasteland in a matter of millennia? This brings us to the unifying theory of the Great Reset, Earth crustal displacement. This theory, famously championed by Professor Charles Hapgood and supported in its early stages by Albert Einstein, suggests that the Earth's lithosphere, the thin, brittle outer shell we live on, is not permanently fixed to the mantle. Under certain conditions of gravitational imbalance, the entire crust can slide as a single unit over the inner layers, much like the skin of an orange sliding over the fruit inside. The trigger for such a displacement is the ice itself. During a glacial period, the ice sheets do not grow symmetrically. Massive, miles-thick domes of ice accumulate in specific regions, such as the North American Hudson Bay or the Antarctic interior. This creates a colossal, lopsided weight on the rotating planet. Centrifugal force acts upon this off-center mass, pushing it toward the equator. If the weight becomes great enough, it can overcome the friction between the crust and the mantle, causing the entire surface of the planet to shift. In this model, the Great Reset of 12,800 years ago was not just a cometary impact, but a crustal shift triggered by the impact's thermal pulse. Antarctica, which may have been located further north in a more temperate latitude, was shoved into the Antarctic Circle. Siberia, which was once home to the mammoth steppe and a temperate climate, was shifted into the Arctic Circle, flash freezing the flora and fauna in a matter of days. This explains why we find mammoths with undigested buttercups in their stomachs, frozen so quickly that their cellular structure remains intact. They didn't die of a slow cooling. They were moved from one climate zone to another in a geological instant. The survivors of the first civilization would have found their world literally turning beneath their feet. Their coastal cities were drowned by the rising oceans, and their agricultural heartlands were shifted into frozen or desert latitudes. The Piri Reis source maps are the cartographic archive of this shift, the last records of a world before the crust moved, preserved by a succession of later cultures who copied the ancient charts without fully understanding the science behind them. The atmosphere of the investigation now shifts from the cold of the poles to the sterile, high-tech labs of the present day. We are currently living in the Holocene interglacial, a 10,000-year period of uncharacteristic stability. We have used this stability to build a global infrastructure that is more complex and more fragile than anything that came before. But as we scan the stratigraphic layers of the forgotten Earth, the modern relevance of this story becomes a matter of survival. The same meltwater pulses that drowned the Gulf of Khambhat are beginning to appear in our modern climate data. The ice sheets of Greenland and West Antarctica are showing signs of structural instability, the same kind of instability that preceded the younger Dryas collapse. The so what of this documentary is a confrontation with our own arrogance. We have treated the history of the Earth as a linear progression, a slow climb toward the pinnacle of now. But the silicates in Libya, the precision-cut stones of Puma Punku, and the geodetic maps of Piri Reis tell us that the pinnacle has been reached before. We are not the first masters of the planet. We are merely the current tenants, living in a house that has been remodeled many times after catastrophic structural failures. The Forgotten Earth is not just a study of the past. It is a manual for the future. The first civilization left their message in stone and mathematics because they knew that those were the only things that could survive the Erasure Mantle. They were signaling to us across the abyss of 12,000 years, trying to warn us of the cyclic nature of the planet's temper. As the sun sets over the Giza Plateau, the shadows of the pyramids stretch across the sand, pointing toward a horizon that has shifted many times in the deep history of the world. The stones remain silent, but their proportions speak. They tell of a time when the stars were different, when the oceans were lower, and when a global culture stood where we stand now, looking up at the same moon and wondering how much time they had left. The investigation into the first civilization is an exercise in humility. It forces us to recognize that our advanced technology is only as permanent as the geological stability of the crust it sits upon. If the ice melts, if the crust shifts, if the sky falls again, what will we leave behind? Will our steel skyscrapers survive the grinding of the glaciers? Will our digital archives survive the oxidation of the atmosphere? Or will we, too, become a stratum of anomalies for some future species to discover 2 million years from now? The call to action is not for a political movement or a scientific initiative. It is a call for a shift in perspective, to look at the Earth not as a resource to be exploited, but as a dynamic, living system with a memory that far exceeds our own. To understand that we are part of a longer, more complex human story, a story that is written in the silent strata and the submerged foundations of our world. The forgotten Earth is waiting to be remembered, and as we continue to dig, to scan, and to decode, we are not just finding our ancestors. We are finding ourselves. The silence of the lunar surface is of a different order than any silence found on Earth. It is an absolute, pressurized absence of vibration, a vacuum where the concept of sound is a physical impossibility. On November 20th, 1969, the Apollo 12 lunar module's ascent stage was intentionally crashed back onto the moon's surface after the astronauts had returned to the command module. The impact, equivalent to 1 ton of TNT, occurred approximately 72 kilometers from the seismic sensors left behind by the crew. The data that began streaming back to Houston was not what the geophysicists had expected. On Earth, a similar impact would produce a seismic signature that lasted for perhaps 2 minutes. A sharp spike followed by a rapid decay as the energy was absorbed by the planet's dense, moisture-rich crust. But the moon did not absorb the energy. It vibrated. For nearly an hour, the moon rang like a bell, a sustained low-frequency resonance that suggested a structure far more rigid and perhaps more hollow than a natural planetary body of its size should be. This seismic anomaly is the starting point for the most controversial chapter of the investigation into the forgotten Earth. If the monuments of Giza and Angkor Wat are geodetic anchors, and if the Piri Reis maps are the remnants of a global survey, then we must confront the possibility that the first civilization did not limit its engineering to the terrestrial crust. We must look at the moon not as a dead rock, but as the great stabilizer, a celestial component in a planetary management system that has been operating for eons. The paradox of the moon begins with its sheer existence. In our solar system, inner rocky planets do not have large moons. Mercury has none. Venus has none. Mars has two tiny, captured asteroids, Phobos and Deimos, which are insignificant compared to the mass of their host. Earth, however, is orbited by a satellite that is 1/4 its own diameter. Mathematically, the moon is far too large for a planet of Earth's size and gravity to have captured from space. The mainstream giant impact hypothesis suggests that a Mars-sized body named Theia struck the proto-Earth 4.5 billion years ago, ejecting a cloud of debris that eventually coalesced into the moon. This theory is designed to explain why the moon is so large and why its isotopic signature is nearly identical to Earth's. But the Theia model fails to account for the orbital perfection of the moon. The moon orbits the Earth at a distance that allows it to perfectly cover the disk of the sun during a total solar eclipse. This is possible because of a staggering mathematical coincidence. The sun is approximately 400 times larger than the moon, and it is also approximately 400 times further away from the Earth. The ratio is 1 to 400 in both size and distance, a symmetry that exists nowhere else in the known solar system. Furthermore, the moon is tidally locked. It rotates on its axis at the exact same speed that it orbits the Earth, ensuring that only one side, the near side, is ever visible to terrestrial observers. From a purely statistical standpoint, the probability of a natural satellite possessing the exact mass, distance, and rotational velocity required to produce a perfect eclipse and a permanent hidden face is astronomical. To an engineer, these are not coincidences. They are design specifications. The composition of the moon adds another layer to the mystery. During the Apollo missions, core samples of the lunar regolith, the fine, abrasive gray dust that covers the surface, revealed high concentrations of titanium, zirconium, and yttrium. These are refractory metals, prized on Earth for their hardness, their resistance to heat, and their use in aerospace engineering. In some areas of the Mare Tranquillitatis, the titanium content of the soil is 10 times higher than that of the richest titanium ores on Earth. Under the scanning electron microscope, the lunar dust is not composed of weathered grains like terrestrial sand. It is composed of impact breccia and microscopic glass spherules, many of which contain traces of helium-3, a rare isotope that is nearly non-existent on Earth but is considered the holy grail of nuclear fusion power. The surface of the moon is not just a wasteland. It is a refined mineral deposit, shielded by a layer of pulverized silicate that has absorbed the solar wind for billions of years. The rebuttal to the natural formation theory lies in the moon's role as a biological stabilizer. Without the moon's massive gravitational pull, the Earth's axial tilt, its obliquity, would not be stable. Over millions of years, the Earth would wobble violently, swinging from 0 degrees to 90 degrees. This would result in catastrophic climate shifts, where the poles would occasionally face the sun directly, melting the ice caps in weeks, while the equator would freeze. The moon acts as a gravitational gyroscope, pinning the Earth's tilt at a consistent 23.5 degrees. This stability is what allowed for the long-term evolution of complex life and, eventually, the rise of the first civilization. If that civilization reached a level of technological maturity where they understood the fragility of their environment, would they not have sought to ensure the permanence of the great stabilizer? Some alternative researchers suggest that the first civilization was not merely terrestrial, but translunar. They propose that the anomalies we see on the moon, the ringing seismic signature, the titanium-rich crust, the perfect orbital ratios, are the result of a massive, ancient project to fortify or adjust the moon to ensure the long-term habitability of the Earth. In this view, the moon is the ultimate time capsule, a celestial monument that watches over the erasure mantle of the planet below. The investigation now moves toward the final synthesis, the unifying theory that connects the silicates in Libya, the pyramids of Giza, the maps of Antarctica, and the resonance of the moon into a single, coherent narrative of human history. We must envision the Earth not as a series of disconnected eras, but as a cyclic system. The first civilization was likely the product of a previous great summer, an interglacial period similar to our own that occurred over 100,000 years ago. During this time, they developed a global culture based on harmonic technology, a science that utilized the resonance of stone, the piezoelectric properties of quartz, and the orbital mechanics of the Earth-Moon system. They were a civilization that did not view themselves as separate from the planet. Their architecture was geodetic, their agriculture was genetic, and their energy was atmospheric. But they were also a civilization that lived under the shadow of the Great Reset. They understood that the Earth's orbit is subject to periodic eccentricities, cycles of 30,000 and 100,000 years known as Milankovitch cycles, that trigger the return of the ice. Approximately 12,800 years ago, this civilization reached its terminal phase. Whether it was a cometary impact, a solar flare, or a crustal displacement, they knew the Great Winter was returning. They began the process of seeding the future. They built the Great Pyramid as a geodetic backup, a stone archive of the Earth's dimensions. They engineered maize as a biological backup, a high-calorie fuel source for the survivors. They mapped the entire planet, including the soon-to-be-frozen Antarctica, and stored the charts in libraries that would eventually be copied by the Sumerians, the Egyptians, and the Ottomans. And then, the Erasure Mantle descended. The younger Dryas was not just a cold snap, it was a planetary scouring. The tsunamis of the meltwater pulses wiped the coastal cities from the map. The volcanic winters buried the inland complexes under ash and silt. The survivors, reduced to a handful of sages or culture heroes, retreated to the high-altitude outposts like Tiwanaku or the subterranean shelters of Derinkuyu. Over the next 1,200 years of darkness, the deep knowledge was lost. The harmonic technology became impossible to maintain without the global infrastructure it required. The sages died out, leaving behind only the high myths, the stories of gods who could move mountains and fly across the sea. These myths became the basis for the second civilization, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Indus Valley culture, who inherited the ruins and the seeds, but forgot the science. We are the children of that amnesia. We look at the H-blocks of Puma Punku and see a mystery because we have been taught that history is a one-way street. We cannot conceive of a past that was more advanced than our present. But the geological record is indifferent to our pride. It shows us that the Earth has reset many times, and each time, it has digested the evidence of what came before. The so what of this long-form investigation is a call to a new kind of planetary literacy. We are currently entering a period of renewed instability. The Holocene stability is fracturing. The magnetic poles are wandering at an accelerated rate. The ice sheets are thinning. The black mat layer in the soil is a reminder that the sky can fall at any moment. If we are to survive the next Great Reset, we must stop viewing history as a collection of artifacts and start viewing it as a series of warnings. We must look at the forbidden Earth, not with the eyes of a tourist, but with the eyes of an engineer. We must decode the precessional code hidden in our monuments and the genetic code hidden in our crops. The atmospheric detail of this story is one of a looming dusk. We are in the late afternoon of our own great summer. The shadows are lengthening, and the silent strata are beginning to vibrate with the echoes of the past. The textures of the stone, the cold of the tunnels, and the weight of the sediment are all telling us the same thing. Nothing is permanent. The Great Pyramid still points to the stars, marking a time that has passed and a time that is coming again. The Gulf of Khambhat still holds the ruins of a city that thought it would last forever. The moon still rings with the resonance of an ancient impact. These are the signposts of the Erasure Mantle, and they are the only maps we have for the territory ahead. As we conclude this documentary journey for the Forgotten Earth, the final image is not one of despair, but of continuity. We are part of a lineage of world builders who have faced the fire and the flood before. The first civilization did not entirely disappear. They live on in the 43,200 ratio, in the Z-maze in our fields, and in the very shape of the world we inhabit. The story of the lost civilizations that came before us is the story of ourselves, seen through a glass, darkly. It is a story of resilience, of brilliance, and of the relentless, crushing beauty of a planet that refuses to be mastered. The Earth is a museum of the forgotten, but for those who know how to read the stone, the memory is still alive. The percussion drill in Libya, the sonar in India, the radar in Indonesia, they are all part of a great awakening. We are finally beginning to remember who we were, and in that remembrance, we might just find the key to who we must become. The silence of the Earth's mantle is not a true silence. It is a pressurized, subsonic groan. While the surface of the planet is scoured by the winds of the Holocene and the waves of the rising oceans, the deep crust remains a repository of secrets that are only now being decoded by the most sensitive instruments of the 21st century. In 2022, a global network of seismic sensors, designed to monitor the shifting of tectonic plates, began to record a series of anomalous reflections from the transition zone between the upper and lower mantle, approximately 660 kilometers beneath the Tibetan Plateau and the high Arctic. These reflections, known in geophysical circles as large low-shear velocity provinces or LLSVPs, are typically interpreted as thermochemical piles, massive blobs of denser, hotter material that have sunk toward the core mantle boundary over billions of years. They are described by mainstream geology as the roots of mantle plumes, the slow-moving engines of volcanic activity. But the 2022 data revealed a structural regularity that defies the chaotic logic of fluid dynamics. Within these deep-seated anomalies, the seismic waves did not simply slow down. They were refracted in a manner that suggested a series of interconnected, geometric voids, cavities of immense scale, reinforced by a material that is significantly more rigid than the surrounding peridotite. The paradox of these deep crust voids lies in the physics of lithostatic pressure. At a depth of 600 kilometers, the weight of the overlying rock is approximately 20 gigapascals, roughly 200,000 times the atmospheric pressure at sea level. According to the Standard Model, no hollow structure could possibly exist at this depth. The rock would behave like a plastic, flowing inward to fill any vacuum in a matter of seconds. Yet, the seismic data persists in showing acoustic shadows that are perfectly spherical or hexagonal, measuring tens of kilometers in diameter. The skeptic's view, the authoritative stance of the geological community, is that these voids are an artifact of the data processing. They argue that the seismic waves are being scattered by high-pressure mineral phases, such as ringwoodite or bridgemanite, which can contain significant amounts of water trapped within their crystalline structure. They suggest that what we are seeing is not a cavity, but a mush zone of hydrated minerals that mimics the acoustic signature of a void. It is a conservative, materialist explanation that keeps the history of the Earth safely within the realm of the inorganic. But the rebuttal is found in the harmonic uniformity of the signals. When the seismic reflections from the Tibetan voids are compared to those found beneath the Arctic and the South Pacific, they exhibit an identical resonant frequency. This suggests a global network of structures that are not only similar in shape but are constructed to a specific, repeating blueprint. Mathematically, the probability of natural mineral phases forming identical, geometrically perfect mush zones on opposite sides of the planet is negligible. We are looking at the possibility of a deep crust infrastructure, a subterranean refuge, or a planetary-scale engineering project designed by the first civilization to survive the surface-level erasures of the younger Dryas and the previous Great Resets. This is the ultimate frontier of the Forgotten Earth, the transition from a surface-dwelling species to a subterranean one. If the sages of the Pleistocene zenith realized that the crust was destined to shift and the oceans were destined to rise, their most logical path would not have been to the high plateaus, but into the mantle itself. The technology required to maintain a void against gigapascals of pressure is beyond our current comprehension, yet it is a direct extension of the piezoelectric engineering we see in the granite chambers of the Great Pyramid. If you can manipulate the lattice of a crystal to resonate at a specific frequency, you can theoretically create a standing wave of pressure that counteracts the weight of the world above. The atmosphere of this final investigation is one of staggering scale. We are no longer looking at individual ruins. We are looking at the planet as a machine. The forgotten Earth is not a graveyard of people, but a museum of an idea, the idea that a civilization can become a geological force. As we move from the seismic anomalies of the deep crust to the philosophical so what of this journey, we must confront the texture of time itself. To the first civilization, time was not a line. It was a circle defined by the precession of the equinoxes and the Milankovitch cycles. They understood that the Holocene, our current 10,000-year summer, is merely a brief thaw in the middle of a 2-million-year ice age. We are living in a temporary window of habitability, a fragile clearing in a forest of ice. The modern relevance of this realization is profound. We have built a world based on the myth of permanence. We believe that because we have mapped the surface of the planet, we are its masters. But our maps are only valid for the current sea level, and our history is only valid for the current stratigraphic layer. The Erasure Mantle is not a thing of the past. It is a process that is currently unfolding. The rising tides, the wandering magnetic poles, and the thinning of the ozone layer are the first shutters of the next reset. The first civilization left us a manual for survival in the form of the Great Circle, the precessional numbers, and the genetic masterpieces like maize. They were telling us that the only things that survive a reset are those that are integrated into the fundamental constants of the universe. Stone, mathematics, biology. These are the deep data of human existence. Our modern high-tech world, our silicon chips, our fiber optic cables, our satellite arrays is remarkably fragile. In a global crustal displacement, our entire digital history would be erased in a single day, leaving behind nothing but a layer of oxidized heavy metals and crushed glass. The forgotten Earth teaches us that we are a species with amnesia, but it also suggests that the amnesia is a choice. We can choose to look at the anomalous silicates in Libya and see a manufacturing error, or we can see a fragment of a lost industry. We can look at the ringing moon and see a seismic quirk, or we can see a celestial stabilizer. The investigation is a challenge to our perception of what is possible. The call to action is a subtle, internal one. It is an invitation to walk through the world with a geological eye, to stand in a forest and wonder what lies 200 meters beneath the roots, to look at a mountain and see the possibility of a buried pyramid, to look at the stars and recognize the clock of the great year that is currently ticking toward the next hour. The story of the lost civilizations that came before us is not a tragedy. It is a story of incredible persistence. It tells us that even when the sky falls and the oceans rise, something remains. A grain of corn, a stone foundation, a mathematical ratio. We are the inheritors of that persistence. We are the second act of a play that has been performed many times before on a stage that is periodically cleared for the next performance. The silence of the documentary concludes not with a finality, but with a lingering resonance. The textures of the forgotten Earth, the cold of the andesite, the dry dust of the Sahara, the humid shadows of the Mekong, are the sensory links to our predecessor. They are the tactile proofs that we are not alone in time. We are part of a massive, rolling wave of human achievement that rises, peaks, and breaks, only to rise again from the depths of the next era. The light of the sun, reflecting off the white casing stones that once covered the Great Pyramid, would have been visible from miles away, a beacon of mathematics in a world of sand. Today, we see only the core, the silent bones of the structure. But the proportions are still there. The $1:43, $200 scale is still there. The message is still being broadcast, waiting for a civilization that is scientifically literate enough to decode it and humble enough to heed it. The investigation ends where it began, with the weight of the sediment. But now, the sediment does not feel like a burial shroud. It feels like a protective layer. It is the mantle of erasure that preserves the seeds of the past for the students of the future. We are those students. And as we close this chapter of The Forgotten Earth, We do so with the realization that the most important discoveries are not found in the ground, but in the shift of perspective that allows us to see the ground for what it truly is, a ledger of the impossible. The Earth remembers. It remembers the first world, the great flood, and the sages of the ice. It remembers the mountain of light and the city of the sea. And as we move forward into the uncertain horizons of our own era, we carry that memory with us. A silent, heavy, and spectacular legacy that defines our place in the deep time of the cosmos.